We'll get started. So welcome to this Cardiff University Informing Policy webinar. And this is where the university is providing a space for our academics to speak directly with policymakers on a variety of topics so that their research expertise can help you to inform policy development. I'm pleased to tell you that today's webinar is entitled The Failure of Carbon Zero in Mobility Policy. And we're very lucky to hear from Professor Peter Wells. He's the Professor of Business and Sustainability at the Director of the Centre for Automotive Industry Research, and he's also Cardiff Business School's Pro Dean for Public Value. He's a renowned academic and automotive industry expert. He's been at the forefront of automotive research since joining the business school in 1990. As the Director of the Centre for Automotive Industry Research, he has significantly advanced our understanding of the automotive sector. His extensive body of work covers a wide range of topics from supply chains, manufacturing to regulation and sustainability, all aimed at fostering a more sustainable automotive industry. And building on that career trajectory, in 2012, he co-founded the Cardiff University Centre for Excellence for Electric Vehicles. And this is a centre that's collaborating across multiple disciplines. So Peter's a real global leader of electric automotive research. He's also the host of the Business School's brand new Public Value podcast series, which you can find on YouTube and Spotify. We released our first episode this week about the living wage. We're also pleased to be joined by Rhiannon Hardiman, a change maker with the Office of the Future Generations Commissioner for Wales, and her focus is on specifically climate, nature and decarbonisation. Rhiannon supports public bodies, including Welsh Government, to deliver policy in line with the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. Prior to joining the Commissioner's office, Rhiannon was Wales manager with Living Streets, a charity advocating for everyday walking, clean air and transport decarbonisation. So thanks ever so much for coming, and I'm now pleased to hand over to Peter and then Rhiannon to discuss the failure of carbon zero in mobility policy in more detail. Thanks very much. I think we're starting with Peter first. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I've got a short presentation. I'm just going to romp through it very quickly. In essence, it's a presentation in two parts. First part is going to talk about the kind of net zero piece overall, and the second part is much more focused about automotive industry, which is my area of expertise. Just like to say thank you for the opportunity to speak with you this morning. And, I think it's something that is very timely. We've had all the issues around the 20-mile-an-hour speed limit, of course. And as Lee Waters was saying, actually, that's just the start. There's a lot more to come, and we have to do more to change and change quickly. So this presentation very much echoes some of those sentiments, and I would say is quite closely aligned, perhaps surprisingly for you, quite closely aligned to what he was saying. I've got a story of self-deception in two parts. So the first part of that self-deception is that the net zero is itself a flawed target. And that the second part is really that even if we do achieve zero carbon, the environmental, social, economic costs will be huge. There are many, many other problems that come with the solution to the problem we're trying to fix. And we need to be cognizant of these things and do something about it. So just as way of a background, I'm not a climate change expert by any means, but I think I have some understanding of what's going on here. So you'll see in 2018, if you looked at the total carbon budget, in other words, the remaining amount of carbon that the modelling sort of suggested that we could continue to put into the atmosphere, that was estimated at around 500 gigatons. And we were, around the world, emitting around 33 gigatons per annum. So that gave us actually to around 2034 if we didn't do something about it. This is already a long way away from 2050. And then, of course, we had the pandemic, and we had a lot of hope about building back better. And all the indicators showed that during the pandemic, not only did our economic activity go down, but of course, so did also our carbon emissions around the world. So here we are, then by 2022, we've got a new normal being established. But actually, the new normal was pretty much like the old normal. So what we see was economic growth kicked back in, and so too did energy consumption, and so too did emissions. And so at the moment, it's looking at around about 36, 37 gigatons of CO2 in 2022. And we've got around about 300 gigatons of the carbon budget left. And the tragedy of this, really, is that we knew. So that we had the Rio Summit in 1992. We had the Stern Review, of course, in 2006. And Stern was right. If we had started to make those changes then, we wouldn't be facing the cliff that we're facing now. Now, of course, we can't turn back the clock. We are where we are. But I think it's worth saying that we had those opportunities. And we shouldn't forget that, because in a way, what's going on now with the current government is that they seem to be repeating this process. They seem to be deferring a process of change and saying we've got more time. So just to give a little bit of data on this, this is from the World in Data. Top bar shows electricity, bottom bar shows total energy consumption. So in terms of electricity generation, what we see is 75% is still essentially fossil fuels. Then we've got nuclear at 10%. And to be honest, I don't count nuclear as low carbon. I know officially it does, but that seems to me disingenuous, to say the least. But then if you look at the total energy consumption, what you can see that it's a major problem. Already we're still at 1/3 dependent on oil, and the renewables are a tiny fraction of the total. And I just want to show this change over time as well. So here's electricity production by source over time around the world. And what this shows you is that the dip in kind of 2008-9, which was the global financial crisis, the dip in 1920, 21, which was the COVID crisis, of course. But other than that, it's a pretty well continuous process of continued growth in consumption, not just of renewables, but also of all the others. So it's perhaps some debate around where we hit that turning point, but at least historically, we haven't hit it yet. And that's important to understand how tiny the amount of renewables in terms of their contribution is to the total of energy production. And then we look at this in a slightly different way. This is, rather than just looking at electricity, this is global primary energy consumption. Again, we see oil, coal, and gas, they're right up there. And the others are down below. And even some of those are questionable. And for example, if we look at modern biofuels, I dare say that includes the Drax power station, which to me is not really a renewable energy production system at all. It's got nuclear in there again, and the other remaining renewables are very, very small. So that's the backdrop, really, as to what we've achieved so far. The trouble is that what I see at the moment going on is a lot of very distant targets, but very little or not sufficient concrete action ahead of those targets. When the original agreement under the Paris Agreement for those kind of 2050 targets included the notion that we had to deliver substantial change ahead of them. In other words, by 2030, we needed to have a 43% transfer of our energy consumption into zero carbon sources. So we haven't achieved that important stepping stone towards net zero, and we're continuing to develop those high carbon sources of energy. So we're continuing with new coal mines, we're continuing with oil fields and gas stations and so on. So we're already in a big problem. And then we've got the issues around actually what are the other concerns with these renewable energy sources. And I get this sense that people think that renewable means infinite. Of course, the sun's there, it's going to be there for a long time. There's lots of it, there's lots of wind, there's plenty of waves. On the other hand, it's really difficult to access that sort of power. And we're beginning to see all the issues around trying to recycle some of these things. Recycling solar panels is itself a massive problem. Turbine blades, amazing piece of aerospace technology, but on the other hand, really difficult to recycle. And hydropower isn't what people think it is. In many cases, hydro power stations generate significant emissions, mostly methane, from the land that's been submerged when the hydro station is put in place. So I get this sense that actually renewable is not infinite. And if we choose to use our renewable energy in one area, then we do not have it available for something else. In other words, we're facing these choices. And I got this quote here from Lufthansa. It's actually talking about e-fuels, but it gives you a flavor of this. The guys from Lufthansa are saying that they want all the available e-fuels. They are zero carbon fuels produced by hydro or some other source that can be used as a liquid fuel in airplanes, vehicles, etc. Lufthansa wants them all because they say they have no alternative. So then, yeah, just quickly to go through cars. Well, first of all, we've lived through this revolution that we haven't noticed of SUVs. And today, around the world, SUVs constitute more than 50% of new car sales. Which itself is problematic because those vehicles will be in use, rolling around for many years to come with their high fuel consumption, with their high carbon emissions. But not only that, it's formed a culture of car ownership and use, which has then been transferred into our electrification strategies. So we see a boom in these great big electric SUVs. And so we're trying to electrify what is an unsustainable pattern of vehicle use. And I see that that's politically appealing. You know, I can see that it offers us the chance to continue with our lifestyles without having to confront those difficult changes. And again, think back to the 20-mile-an-hour debate, you know, a very modest change in all fairness. And the amount of kickback has been quite astonishing. But we're not just going in that direction. We're hugely subsidizing. The amount of government money around the world is astonishing. I mean, typically around the world at the moment, 20% of the investment cost of any battery factory is being subsidized by the state. And in most cases, the state does not have ownership. It does not have the ability to generate returns from that investment. It simply is a subsidy, which locks governments into this big battery future. And we have many other subsidies available, of course, as I've shown here. And at a macro level, what we see is this increasingly tense global position around the combination of subsidy and trade. So the European Union has their temporary crisis and transition framework. China's got their new energy program. US has got their Inflation Reduction Act. These are all attempts to build barriers and to protect manufacturing within those different regional blocks. And we see it inside those blocks as well. So there's currently a kind of ongoing bidding war between countries within Europe, between the states of the United States, and so on. All of that is going on, is playing into the hands of this continued automobility framework, which is absolutely grounded on our assumptions of vehicle size and vehicle use. It's quite clear that these things actually contravene World Trade Organization rules unless you come up with a kind of cunning way around. And this is kind of what France is proposing. So what France is saying is, well, actually, we should regulate the cars coming into the market from outside of the European Union based on their total life cycle energy cost, or if you like, their total life cycle carbon emissions. And of course, they're saying that because in France, they have a high nuclear fleet, very significant for their zero carbon electricity production, which then translates into very low carbon manufacturing. Meanwhile, in China, those cars are being built from using electricity from stations powered by brown coal. So this is not a trade policy at all. This is an environmental policy. It just so happens to benefit France. These are our current choices. Mostly we're going for the one on the left, the Audi SQ8 e-tron, mildest vehicle, 100,000 pounds. Look at the weight. That's 2,700 kilos of car, typically with an occupancy rate of 1.2 people. Very inefficient. The battery alone weighs 700 kilos. This is an enormous amount of resource packaged into one vehicle. We have the Citroën Me. It's a kind of cutesy little thing. It's kind of more suited in many respects to our urban environments, but you'll be lucky to see one in the United Kingdom, that's for sure. And just to make the point that one of these large batteries could support at least 175 high-spec e-bikes. Just to go briefly at the energy side of all of this, 2020, the Great Britain road sector was using 400 terawatt hours of energy. So that's 30% of total energy consumption within the GB. In 2020, UK demand for electricity was 299 terawatt hours. And looking at where we're going with this, with the electrification of our current car fleet and the assumption that we're going to do it for all of them, we're looking at maybe 65 to 100 terawatt hours by 2050 just to move the vehicles around, out of a total electricity of around 600 to 900 terawatt hours. So planning ahead, planning for that growth, planning for the continued use of cars in this sort of way commits a huge amount of resources to their continued use on the roads. And that may not be the baseline. And if we do electrify much more broadly and we do accelerate our use of vehicles and our use of these very big vehicles, then we could be in the national grid high energy scenario. And it's been covered, but perhaps not covered enough, that there are a wider social and environmental costs from electrification. We have issues of human slavery, child slavery in some of these poorer countries where many of the kind of scarce materials are coming from. There's many pollution issues associated with the production of these materials. And of course, there's the geopolitical risks, which we increasingly are concerned about, and particularly in terms of dependence with other nations and other trading blocs. But of course, these risks are multiplied because we're building cars that are 2,700 kilos, and because we assume that we're going to replace the entire car fleet, which in the UK is at least 30 million cars. Meanwhile, we're kind of pretty systematically excluding other more efficient ways of getting about. Cycling remains a challenge here in Wales, not easy. It's amazing to me that we have been unable as a society to find any room for electric scooters. Just astonishing that we can't have them on the roads or the pavements, and yet we allow cars to park everywhere. And so we seem to have this assumption that we can achieve a zero carbon, high energy society. And we still have that formula in our heads. Travel is good, more travel is better. We seem to think of travel and mobility as a human right, but also we value it very, very highly. And I think there's a concern with that. You know, the more elite our travel, the more high we value it. I'm working with a colleague at the moment who's looking at space tourism, and we see that pattern being repeated even in the heady realms of space tourism. So what do I conclude from this? Quick romp through. I don't think we're going to hit the 450 target. We're not going to hit the 1.5 degrees target. We're going to have to deal with the consequences. And on that, I would say that so far, the scientists have been really typically scientists, and they've been cautious, they've been moderate. They've said, no, we think it could be like this. The outcomes that we are currently observing already are at the worst end of the worst case scenario. Ocean temperatures going up, global temperatures going up, ice caps melting, all of those things going on much more quickly, much more alarmingly than most of the science modeling seems to suggest. So we're going to blow all our resources on solutions that aren't solutions. And so I think we need to really shift our focus from predict and provide to predict and prevent. We can see these things coming. Now is the time. We have to change that strategy and be honest. We can't continue as we are. And so that to me means zero carbon, yes, but only combined with low energy solutions. And so fundamentally, it's not about doing more with less. It's about doing less with less.
Thanks so much, Peter. Over to you, Rhiannon, to respond.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Peter. That was fascinating. Thank you for all of that insight. There's definitely a lot there for us to think about, isn't there? And I think the phrase that came to mind for me listening to that, you know, there are different schools of thought around how to tackle climate change, and one of those is that the technology will save us. And it's this idea that we can carry on as we are, but the technology being things like electric vehicles means that we can just carry on as we are, when that simply isn't the case. And I think, you know, I do agree with what you've been saying there completely. And I think, you know, one thing that we need to do is reduce our consumption. I think, that's clearly something that we haven't quite grappled with yet. And one of those ways is that we need to actually reduce our dependency on cars, I think. I think that's where we've kind of ended up, isn't it, as a society, that we feel like we need cars for everything. We've made it really easy to drive places. As you said, cars can park anywhere, drive anywhere, but we've made it quite difficult to choose other modes of transport at the same time, haven't we? So expecting people to make that shift when the world around them doesn't fit that's a really big ask of people, I think. And we're seeing some backlash to that now, as you said, with some current policy moves. And I think, over the years, what we've done, we've looked at trends that car use is going to increase. I think, we've actually encouraged that to happen as well. Policy over the decades, that's the direction it's gone. And we've tried to deliver infrastructure to meet that as well, but there's only so much, isn't there, of our land, our public space that we can actually give over to vehicles. So I think, I completely agree. We need to be thinking more preventatively. We need to be thinking more long term and actually thinking about how do we want our communities to function? What do we want our spaces to be like, and how do we get around in our spaces? And I think that's so relevant to Wales as well, because we actually have a statutory duty to start thinking more like this. We've got the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which my office, the Office of the Future Generations Commissioner, is responsible for promoting and ensuring that is applied to policy making in Wales. And one of the key things of that piece of legislation is to find that balance across wellbeing dimensions, so the environmental, the social, the cultural, and the economic, being in balance. And Peter, you touched on a lot of those in your presentation. And in Wales, of course, that's in pursuit of achieving what we have as well-being goals in Wales, which is to have a Wales which is ecologically resilient, that it's prosperous, equal, healthier, that it's culturally vibrant, that we have cohesive communities, and really importantly, that we're globally responsible as well. And, you've talked a lot there about actually those finite resources out there. It's not actually... renewable energy is not actually that finite solution that we believe it is. And, there are ways of working that the Wellbeing Act implies as well. And, we need to be thinking much more about involving people who are affected by our planning decisions. Finding also commonalities and integration across different policy areas. Let's think about how transport interacts with housing or education. Where are those intersections in different policy areas, so that we can find actually ways of making it easier for people to live their lives in a way which is much more low carbon and low energy intensive. Collaborating, looking at more preventative approaches to tackling things like climate change, preventing problems getting worse, and thinking long term, as I mentioned before, future trends. What is that future that we actually want to achieve? And let's, as you say, predict and deliver against the actual future that we want. So I think, a lot of what's in the Wellbeing Act really resonates strongly with some of those things that you've been saying today. And it actually does come through in our planning policy. So sustainable development is the core principle behind the Wellbeing Act, and actually it features strongly in planning policy in Wales. We have it as well in our transport strategy in Wales as well. The transport strategy is called Llwybr Newydd, which literally translates to mean a new path. And there's a lot in there that echoes what's been said today around changing the focus of transport policy, where cars have been far too dominant for far too long. So yeah, one of the things in Llwybr Newydd actually is to actually reduce the number of car miles travelled for each person in Wales. There are some bold commitments in there, things which are going to be a big leap for people to actually have this wholesale change in how we see mobility and how we get around. One of the things in our planning policy in Wales is called a sustainable transport hierarchy. So when we're planning for new housing estates, new infrastructure, we need to be putting walking at the top of our planning, then cycling, then public transport. Absolutely key. If you're building a new housing estate, those public transport options need to be there when people move in. It's about habit forming, isn't it? So people actually become more used to leaving their cars at home. And only after those other things have been prioritised do we then look at the needs of other sorts of private vehicles. But I think there's one other thing as well, which if we're talking about a really good shift in our behaviour, and modal shift, as we call it, isn't it, in transport, is about accessibility and accessible transport. And it's, it's a really important part of being a more equal Wales as well. So we're seeing things like demand responsive transport being piloted, things like accessible level boarding on new trains and buses, really good access to information, things like this. So people are actually able to start understanding that there's a role for them to play in actually being able to shift their mindset around how we see transport, and that transport, actually mass transit, which is a much more effective way of achieving our net zero targets, is actually there for everybody. That's not just about creating the infrastructure, it's about providing information for people as well, really good data, really good real-time data on public transport networks, about connecting services and onward routes, things as well like placemaking, how we actually develop our streets and places to be welcoming places for people. So we're actually encouraging much more of that shift away from driving to walking and cycling. That, of course, is one of the key pillars of the 20 mile an hour policy that we've just seen launched in Wales. It's about creating a safer street environment where more people then make those right choices to leave their car at home and to be able to choose other ways of getting around in their community. We've got to talk as well about, with the transport system, about biodiversity as well, and nature loss in Wales is something that's happening in parallel with climate change. So how can we actually look at a transport system that's actually providing for nature recovery as well? Things like encouraging biodiversity with bee bus stops with green roofs, the spaces around train stations being returned to green space for communities, and really actually thinking about our transport network, our transport system, as something which is providing much more of a service for people, but also for biodiversity as well. And I think, all of these things, what they all do is they contribute to actually achieving that net zero target through behaviour changes, through shifting our reliance on cars, changing our habits, and moving us much more towards a more sustainable approach to mobility and transport. And if we're applying the Wellbeing Future Generations Act to all of our decisions around transport, then those are the sorts of things we're going to get, which will create a transport system which is much more fit for the future.
Thanks very much, Rhiannon, and thanks for your presentation too, Peter. I was frankly flabbergasted by the weight of these SUV vehicles. I know that you've said to me before, Peter, that there's actually lots of implications from like the wear and tear on roads and buildings and car parks that we don't really think about proactively enough. So it really is a massive challenge, isn't it, when our energy consumption just keeps getting more and more. And we've got to try and find the energy whilst battling with that net zero goal.